Hey guys, this is Miss Young. We're going to be taking notes today over social reforms. If you reflect back to the second grade awakening notes that you took, you will recall that social reform are changes in society for the better, trying to make people better. And so that's what these social reforms are going to try and do. So get your pencils ready and let's get started. All right, second great awakening. Again, this is what spurred these social reforms, the need to make people, make society better because it's part of God's plan. Everybody is a part of God's family and everybody deserves to be treated right. And so they would have these large outdoor meetings to revive God's plan, especially the abolitionists. This really spurred the abolition movement and helped it to move forward at a faster rate because it's a part of God's plan. So some social reforms that we are going to cover and take notes on: women's rights movement, temperance movement, education reform, prison and mental health reform, and the abolition movement. And for each one of these, we are going to cover the who, what, when, where, and why. Let's get started. All right, our first social reform is the women's rights movement. Our first person of interest is Susan B. Anthony. She was the leader of the movement. She was actually arrested at one point after voting in a presidential election because women were not legally allowed to vote. We call that type of act civil disobedience, where you disobey the law but you're not being violent about it. Her partner in crime is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They formulated what's called Seneca Falls Convention when they had been denied the opportunity to participate in an anti-slavery rally for the abolitionist movement. They got to go, but the women were not allowed to be amongst the men. They were forced to sit in a separate section that was roped off out of the sight of any of the men, and they were furious. And so they decided to set up their own convention for women's rights, and that's where the Seneca Falls Convention comes in. And they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which is kind of like the Declaration of Independence, but for women. And they read it out loud at the Seneca Falls Convention. The what? What did they fight for? They were for women having being equal to men, better working conditions. If you think back to your Industrial Revolution lesson, factory owners would hire women before men because they could pay them less, but for the same amount of work. And so the women were not getting paid very well at all, with very poor conditions, long hours. Women's suffrage was also something they were trying to get. Suffrage, not suffrage, but suffrage means the right to vote. They wanted to have an opportunity to have a voice in politics. The whole reason behind them not getting to have this is because men didn't value their opinion. They didn't think that they were anything but a trophy, somebody to look good standing next to them. This is during the 1880s to the 1920s. Women really don't even get the right to vote until the 1900s, and that's the 19th Amendment. This basically took place in Seneca Falls, New York. And again, women, why were they doing this? Because women could not bring lawsuits. They could not own property. They could not vote. They were viewed as a way of enhancing the status of their husband. They were expected to stay home, cook, clean, take care of the children, don't say anything because your opinion doesn't matter. And so there are some women who finally decided to step up. So write everything you see and move on when you're ready. All right, our next social reform is the temperance movement. The temperance movement involved women and Christians. Notice this picture here. The sign behind them is quite comical. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. They are trying to send a message. Temperance movement is about the intake of alcohol. And so at the time, they were trying to get rid of alcohol altogether. What they were doing was they were an organized society that worked at trying to stop the drinking of alcohol. Some states actually made it illegal to sell alcohol during the 30s and 40s. Maine was a focal point here. 1851, it was the first state to ban alcohol. And why? Because the women felt like people were losing their belief in God and would stop following Jesus because they were drinking. And the men were abusive, spent all their money. So the women were sick of it. This is kind of right along the skirt tail of the women's rights movement. They were feeling like, you know what, everything's just going crazy. And it has to do with you don't believe in God anymore because you're getting drunk, and then you don't value us. And so they just rolled with it and tried to make life better. They were trying to change society. Again, the idea of the Second Great Awakening, that it's God's plan. We need to take care of each other. And so at one point, I believe in the early 1900s, prohibition does take place. Prohibition is where they completely outlaw all alcohol drinks of any kind. And believe it or not, this is where you get NASCAR. NASCAR started because you had people making moonshine, and they would put it in the back of their vehicles, and at night they would hightail it down the road to take it from point A to point B, and they got to where they had to drive really fast, and they had to soup up their vehicles and make it to where they could handle the weight of the moonshine in the back, make it to where it's super fast so they could outrun the cops. And then at some point it just kind of turned into NASCAR. I don't get it, but I know that that's the root of NASCAR and car racing. So kind of interesting. So write everything you see and move on when you're done. All right, our next social reform is the education reform. Started with Horace Mann. Horace Mann wanted to open free public schools, primarily in the North, for every child. Also opened private grade school and colleges by churches and other groups. He provided training for teachers. This is during the 1800s at Massachusetts. And the whole reason was the wealth of individuals and communities would increase increase with education, and every child deserves to go to school. And so notice here's another school. This is probably in the North. It was a school for blacks only, but for the first time they're getting an education. This is after slavery has been prohibited and outlawed. In the North, though, the slaves had been freed, even in just prior to the Civil War. So write everything you see and move on when you're ready. Our next social reform is the prison and mental health reform. This was started by a woman named Dorothea Dix. She wanted separate jails for women, men, and children. She did not think they all needed to be lumped into the same jail. She also called for prisons to rehabilitate inmates. She felt like if they were in there, you might as well take the time to teach them how to behave properly in society, why you shouldn't steal, why you shouldn't murder, why you shouldn't do all these things, and help retrain their brain into making better decisions. And we still do this to this day, and that's all thanks to Dorothea Dix. She built new hospitals for the mentally ill, the deaf, and the blind. She wanted to improve treatment of prisoners and the mentally ill. She came across some instances where they were put into completely dark rooms, freezing cold, because it was either A, part of their treatment, or B, they were just so neglected and weren't cared about because they thought that they didn't know any better anyways. And so Dorothea Dix felt like these people needed a chance to either be rehabilitated or to give the proper help to help them function in society. Again, this is in the 1800s in the U.S. And the reason is she was appalled at the treatment of prisoners and mentally ill when she visited the facilities. The prisons were dirty and unhealthy. The mentally ill were chained to beds in dark, cold rooms. And so this is, let me go back. Can I go back? No. So that was a picture of a guy who, he's getting electric shock treatment. They thought that electric shock treatment was helpful and helpful with the brain. Not really sure how they thought that, but thank goodness for improvement in technology and smarter people, because that sounds painful. So write everything you see and move on when you're ready. All right, our final social reform is the abolitionist movement. Get ready, this has a lot and it's all necessary. Who? Henry David Thoreau. This guy refused to pay his taxes to a government that supported slavery and came up with the idea of transcendentalism. Now, anytime you disobey the law without being violent, that's called civil disobedience, and that's exactly what Henry David Thoreau did. And it's against the law to not pay your taxes. We learned that during George Washington's presidency with the Whiskey Rebellion, and the farmers tried to not pay their taxes, and he basically said, well, you can just shut up and pay up because the Constitution says you have to. So Henry David Thoreau was being civilly disobedient by not paying those taxes because the government supported slavery. Transcendentalism is this idea that everyone is born with morals, that we should know better than to support slavery, that it doesn't matter if the slaves are the ones supporting your economy, it's not right for them to be treated like property. Harriet Beecher Stowe, another very important abolitionist, she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in Uncle Tom's Cabin, this book explained the evils of slavery and stirred the emotions of the North. When people in the North read this, they were appalled by the descriptions of slaves and their treatment. So really got the northern people, northern states talking about how are we going to get rid of slavery. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, these were slaves that were freed or escaped, and they also helped other slaves flee to the north and into Canada. At this point, Canada had outlawed slavery. I do believe it was still controlled by the British, and the British had outlawed slavery up there. So they were getting slaves up to the Canada because they would be considered free. These two people would also speak at northern rallies and publish anti-slavery writings. Like Frederick Douglass wrote a narrative, wrote the book Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And again, it really stirred the emotions of the northern states and giving them some insight on what slavery was really like. Here's some maps to show you how the Underground Railroad worked. Now, when I say Underground Railroad, I'm not talking about railroads underground. Maybe a few tunnels, but no. This is just literally those red lines just show trails and pathways and maybe a few tunnels that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and many other abolitionists would take with slaves that were trying to escape and getting them up to the northern states and up on into Canada. William Lloyd Garrison is another gentleman you need to know. He was a newspaper editor who wrote openly about the reality of slavery, and the First Amendment supports that. The First Amendment allows freedom of speech, freedom of press, and he could write about the slavery and exactly what it was about and how it went down and how ugly it really was. And it, again, stirred the emotions of the North. So what was the purpose of the abolitionist movement? It was literally the movement to stop slavery. It eventually does divide the country as one of the causes of the Civil War. This is in the 1800s on into the 1900s. And we do eventually outlaw slavery, but it takes years and years and years for especially the South to actually let that go. Because what started out as a necessity for their farms and the economy turned into hatred towards African Americans because they felt like they weren't human, they weren't a person. and felt like, why should I respect you? Why should I come into your shop? If you're going to own a store, I'm not coming. You're not a person anyways. I'm not coming into your store. And so the Southerners really struggled to turn that around, and we have come so far. And the reason the abolitionists wanted to do this was because they felt like African Americans deserved to live enjoyably just like other Americans. Again, that idea of the Second Great Awakening, that we are all God's people, no matter our color, and we deserve to be treated fairly. So write everything you see and move on when you're ready.